A trade group for animal experimenters wants to force airlines to transport monkeys to U.S. labs and have complained to the U.S. Department of Transportation. Here's what you can do to save the monkeys. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil, Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, without the monkeys, all U.S. labs, meaning research universities and commercial outfits, have been successfully stopped from performing what is often useless and cruel experiments. Airlines have just said no to the transport of monkeys. That's the way it should stay. But now a trade group, the National Association of Biomedical Research, wants to change that. It's going to the U.S. Department of Transportation and filing a complaint to make the DOT force airlines to carry the monkeys. That story next on the PETA Podcast. But first, thanks again for joining us here on the PETA Podcast. Please share a link with friends. That's important. Pass it around one set of ears to another. Let all your contacts know the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. And if you're new to podcasting, binge away. When you're driving, doing the dishes, before you go to sleep, you can start off with episode number 1. That's PETA President and co-founder Ingrid Newkirk. Start with that, go backwards. Like I said, you don't have to count sheep. See what PETA did for the companion animals adrift during and after Hurricane Florence. That's in episode 36. If you're getting cold and thinking about buying wool, listen to Don Gaines in our last podcast talk about why wool is a fabric of pain and suffering. Find out all of that by listening to our podcast. Remember, if you're on Apple Podcasts, don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps the algorithm know that PETA has a podcast on the issues important to you. Now, if you really want to help the animals, you can always hit the Donate Now button at PETA.org. And if you're high-tech and have Amazon's Alexa, it's as easy as saying, Alexa, donate to PETA. Joining me now is Kathy Guillermo, Senior Vice President of PETA, with more on this. Kathy, when you were last on our program a few weeks ago, you told me that Airbridge Cargo, an air carrier that was shipping thousands of monkeys to U.S. laboratories, you told me about their story. What has happened since then?
Well, just to remind listeners about Airbridge Cargo, this is a cargo company that is owned by the Russian government, and they were bringing thousands and thousands of monkeys into the United States for use in laboratories. And thanks to the support from tens of thousands of PETA members who contacted the airline, Airbridge Cargo changed its policy and it stopped shipping these monkeys. This set off a chain of reaction that led to an organization called the National Association for Biomedical Research filing a legal complaint with the Department of Transportation. So first of all, National Association of Biomedical Research, commonly called NABR, is a trade group for animal experimenters. It is funded by people who put animals in laboratories and do terrible things to them, and its sole purpose is to promote the use of animals for experimentation. It spends a good deal of its time fighting animal rights activists. What the National Association for Biomedical Research has done is file a legal complaint with the Department of Transportation to try to compel 4 airlines to transport monkeys to the U.S. Now, these airlines are United, Qatar Airlines, China Southern, and British Airways, and they are airlines that for many years have had a policy against transporting monkeys to laboratories anywhere in the world. And if NABR is successful at this, if the Department of Transportation should agree with these animal experimenters, then these airlines would be forced to transport monkeys to the U.S. to laboratories.
So right now, these 4 airlines don't do it, and I think when in subsequent PETA podcasts, we've talked about this issue. There's like one airline right now that transports monkeys, or there's just not many of them, right?
That's right. The only big airline that transports monkeys to laboratories right now is Air France. Until July of this year, it was Air France and Airbridge Cargo. And when Airbridge Cargo made the compassionate decision to stop this bloody business, that left only Air France. And the animal experimenters were having trouble getting their hands on enough monkeys to experiment on them.
So essentially what happens when you limit the number of transporters, you kind of cut off the supply of monkeys, and you essentially do really, you get into the process and you can stop experimentation because they don't have anything to experiment on. Is that it? Do you essentially stop experimentation if you cut off the monkey supply?
Well, we can stop a lot of the experimentation that way, because let's not make any mistake about this. This boils down to money. If experimenters have to buy monkeys who are born and raised in the United States, by some estimates, the cost of each monkey is about $6,000. If they need to bring the monkeys in from overseas, it's only $1,000. So this is about how experimenters can get their hands on lots of monkeys for a low cost so that they can conduct ridiculous experiments on them.
All right, but if they can't get their hands on monkeys and they don't want to spend $6,000 per monkey, is there a cheaper experiment medium that they can turn to in lieu of that? And because it doesn't seem, well, in terms of the economics, yeah, you want to go get the low cost monkey, but why go to that extreme if there might be some other way to experiment, or if you can say, oh, well, I guess we don't need these experiments.
It puts a crimp in what in their plans and what they're trying to do. There's no question about that. Animal experimenters are notorious for not changing their ways. We know that experiments on animals are not working. These drug companies, for example, that are importing monkeys to test new drugs on, acknowledge, as does the U.S. government, that 95% of drugs that test safe and effective in animals fail when they're tried on humans. And yet the experimenters continue to bring monkeys in and continue to test these drugs on monkeys and other animals as though they can't figure out anything else to do. The option is to do something else. There are many methods now that are available to experimenters who are willing to admit that experiments on animals aren't working. A better and newer way has to be found and has to be used. There are forward-thinking scientists who are doing this, but what we need to do is shift that paradigm for experimenters who use monkeys and experimenters who use all the other species as well.
So if airlines can't get monkeys, or if by choice they're saying we're not going to bring monkeys to the labs, that's a good way to effectively stop some experimentation that PETA doesn't want to see.
It is a very good way to stop it. And I think it's important to understand the context. Back in the 90s, some European animal organizations exposed what happens to these monkeys before they're shipped to the United States. And back then, most monkeys were caught in their own homes in China, in Vietnam, in Mauritius, and in some other places that have since limited that capture of monkeys and the trade in monkeys. And they were crammed into these tiny little containers, and they were shipped for hours and hours and thousands of miles across the world to be used in laboratories. The monkeys now primarily come from squalid monkey farms, where they're kept in filthy, small enclosures. They're torn from their families. The boxes that they're shipped in are very tiny, usually wooden boxes. They may be shipped for 30 or 35 hours without getting out of this box, without being fed, and they're put in the cargo holds of these planes and they're brought to the United States. So this is a very nasty trade, and it ends up in the United States in experiments that at best are questionable. And I think most people don't realize that most experiments on animals really have nothing to do with human disease or with saving lives. If I could just mention a couple of these. We have videotape on the PETA website, for example, of a baby monkey in a small cage, and somebody puts a Mr. Potato Head doll in front of that monkey to see how frightened the monkey is of the Mr. Potato Head doll. This costs more than $1 million to U.S. taxpayers. There are experiments involving loneliness and despair and how much monkeys injure themselves in their cages. And I don't, it's hard to explain to people that what we're talking about here is how to get money to conduct experiments, to publish papers, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with human health.
All right. So when Neighbor takes to complaining to the Department of Transportation to try to compel airlines, is it a sign of desperation to compel airlines who don't want to ship and transport monkeys to transport and ship monkeys? Is it a sign of desperation on the part of the experimenters, that Neighbor is doing their bidding? Or how do we view that? I mean, it's a sign that, hey, they're trying to open up the transport. So you must be hurting them in some way.
It's absolutely an act of desperation. They are terrified they can't get a lot of monkeys cheap to conduct their experiments on, and so they have resorted to this quasi-legal method. Their arguments boil down to a couple of things. They say that the airlines, that United, British Airways, Qatar Airlines, and Southern China are discriminating against animal experimenters because they will carry monkeys to zoos, some of them, for example, which of course is absurd because when we talk about zoos, we're talking about conservation of species and 3 or 4 animals at the most, whereas an airline carrying monkeys to laboratories may have 800 or 1,000 monkeys in little cages in their cargo hold. And they also say that this experimentation is saving lives, which, as I've just explained, we know is not true. When you're doing an experiment on animals, as was done at Duke University, involving sex and power in advertising, we are not talking about curing Alzheimer's here. It really comes down to money, and it comes down to how easily they can experiment on animals and how cheaply.
And so Neighbor is trying to compel these airlines, but United, Qatar, China, the airlines you mentioned, British Airways, China Southern, what do they say? And should they be allowed to have any say at all? And, hey, we don't want to do this. Or can't they show some, that their compassion is far more valuable than what Neighbor appears to think? Or they're certainly not lured by commerce because they have said that they don't want to transport. They give up that money. Don't they have a right to do what they want to do?
Well, yes. It's kind of a ridiculous argument to think that a group of animal experimenters who want cheap monkeys can try to force the government to compel airlines to do something they have a policy against. And in fact, these airlines are opposed to this measure. And the way that this process works is that the National Association for Biomedical Research has filed its legal complaint with the Department of Transportation. There was a period for the airlines to respond. They all responded. They all opposed it. They made some very good arguments about why they are not discriminating, why they should not be compelled to risk their employees by transporting monkeys, why they should not be compelled to do the bidding of a private industry in many cases. And the next step after their comment, the attorney for the Department of Transportation will decide should this case move forward or should it be dismissed. On the side of the animal experimenters, not surprisingly, are a whole lot of organizations that conduct experiments on animals, a number of universities, other trade groups, and they have all submitted comments in favor of this argument, in favor of the legal complaint. PETA and other animal groups have filed comments opposing it. The airlines, as I said, have opposed it. And after we let our supporters know what was going on, more than 13,000 people have put comments on the website of this legal docket, since it has to be made public, opposing it. So we will see what happens next.
And what do you expect? I mean, listeners to this, people who support PETA or against animal experimentation, what are you asking them to do? What should they do?
Well, they can go to the PETA website, PETA.org, and there is something on the website that they can click on about animal experimenters trying to force airlines to transport monkeys. And it will take them directly to the Department of Transportation website, and they can leave a comment. And as I said, 13,000 people so far have done this. And this I think is very powerful. It's important, first of all, for the Department of Transportation to know what the public thinks. I think it's also very important for animal experimenters to know that most of the public does not support what they do. In fact, for the first time in history, more than half of the American public opposes experiments on animals for any reason, because it is primarily a moral issue, an ethical issue. It's less about science, since we know that animal experiments don't work, and it is all about compassion. And if we don't have to experiment on animals, we shouldn't, and most of the public agrees with that.
Now you say that animal experimentation doesn't work, and I know that you've talked about this in the past. You've mentioned it even within our conversation here, but I'll mention it to other people. And I think the general public still is under the impression that this is how you get the breakthroughs. The research is helpful. You must not just experiment on monkeys, but also on rats, on mice, on all other kinds of animals, because that's how we're going to get the information. Why is that a fallacy? Why is that? And why is that such an image that's still ingrained in people's minds as a truism?
Well, we can put that down to groups like the National Association for Biomedical Research. What they do is produce articles and websites and advertisements and videos promoting the idea that, first of all, animals are only used when absolutely necessary, and second, that they are essential to finding cures for disease. But what we know is that fewer than 10% of basic animal experiments, basic science using animals, ever lead to treatments for human beings with disease. And we also know that many, many animals are used in experiments that have nothing to do with finding cures. What I find is two different things. The attitude that you just mentioned, that people believe animals are only used if essential and finding cures for disease. And then I find a large group of people who actually think that practice is over and done with, that it is so outdated and so unkind that it must be illegal. And I find it very interesting that those two opinions exist side by side. And I think when we have groups like Neighbor that are promoting the myth that we need animals and that it's only done when it's essential, then we have a real problem, because decisions about funding are being made based on things other than whether or not we're actually going to find cures.
Now, on this issue, in terms of cutting off the supply of monkeys and Neighbor, the trade group, trying to force the airlines to carry the monkeys, do the airlines have any say at all in this? Can they say, no, we're not going to do it. We don't want to do it. Can they say that?
They can't. They have said that. I mean, that's been what is so rewarding over the last decade, as we have worked to persuade airlines not to carry monkeys for experiments. And what persuaded them were the tens of thousands of emails and phone calls and letters that they got from consumers who say, we don't want to have monkeys in the cargo holds of these airlines where we fly. So they have had something to say about it. And I don't think that the government can compel a private company to do the bidding of a small group of animal experimenters. So I very much believe the airlines will win in the end.
Is this one of those things that may be tied up in the courts if the experimenters win and then the airlines end up suing and then it goes up throughout, through the chain? Or do you think that if the airlines can, or if Neighbor, the trade group, can be defeated at this DOT level, that it just ends this call for forcing these private airlines or these airlines to carry monkeys?
Well, if Neighbor loses, if the monkeys and the consumers and the airlines win, I think that will end it entirely. Right now, what we have to see is what the legal team at the Department of Transportation decides, whether or not they think this complaint is valid enough to move forward for an investigation, or whether or not they'll just shut it down here. Obviously, we're hoping they'll shut it down here because we are talking about tens of thousands of monkeys a year who are taken from their families and who are sent to laboratories in the United States and other places around the world. So this is a very critical issue.
And once again, people, if they are listening to this and want to do something, what should they do? And how important is their action here? How critical is their action?
It's so important for people to comment because ultimately these are private companies. And the reason they stopped transporting monkeys was that they heard from the people who fly on these airlines. They have compelling reasons from their customers to stop transporting monkeys. What people can do is go to PETA.org, click on the action alert about flying monkeys to laboratories, and leave a comment on the Department of Transportation website. And, aside from the ethical issues, which we focused on here and which is my main concern, we should also mention the fact that this is something of a public health hazard. Monkeys carry diseases that don't make them sick, but which are transmissible to humans and for which there is basically no cure and very little treatment. Herpes B is one of those diseases that they can carry, and it has a 70% fatality rate when human beings are infected with it. So by trying to compel airlines to carry monkeys, they are not only sending the monkeys themselves to certain misery and death, but they're risking the health of all of the people who work with the airlines, the ground handling crews, and potentially the customers who are flying above the cargo hold.
And is this one of the concerns by the airlines and why they said no? It's not just the experiments, but also some of these other concerns about safety to their own people and the health hazards that you just mentioned?
It is. They are very concerned about the health of ground handling crews and other employees of the airlines who have to have special training, who have to have special equipment. So that is part of their concern. I think their overriding concern is that they want to do what makes good business sense. That's what American industry is about. And it doesn't make good business sense for them to transport monkeys to laboratories. All
right. And once again, our listeners, they can take action by...
Take action at PETA.org.
Kathy Guillermo, Senior VP at PETA, and now it's your turn. Take action. Go to PETA.org. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can also find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on AMOK.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our podcasts on Apple Podcasts where you can rate and review the show. Remember, it helps get the word out about the issues you care about. And don't forget, you can help the animals and PETA, especially if you have Amazon's Alexa. Just say, Alexa, donate to PETA. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. Thank you for listening. I'm Emil Guillermo.